There we are. I think we're getting everything together here. So welcome, 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 and we'll get our thing started here just momentarily. We've got just a couple of quick details to catch up with. Let me make sure we've got the camera on and we've got the recording set there. So very good. So welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us here today for our very hastily put together webinar. Hastily in terms of getting it on the schedule. We've done a good bit of research that has gone into this information that we're sharing here today. Very, very excited about being able to share that with you because we've got an unusual event coming up, and that's what has occasioned our webinar here today. So without further ado, let me see if I can click some buttons here and make everything function the way it should, so that perhaps we can do this. Okay. Good. Now that we have our standard disclaimer in front of us, this is a good indication that we're ready to start our slide presentation, and we do have some slides just to kind of help us work through some fairly detailed information that we want to share during our session here today. But of course, with the disclaimer, but the fact that we're talking about the markets and the potential for making money in the markets, we have to remind ourselves and remind you that past performance is no guarantee of future results. But I think you know that by now. I should certainly hope so if you're joining us here. I see a few new faces in the group, so perhaps this is a good idea to provide that kind of reminder here as well. But we're glad that you could take time to join us here today. And we're talking about trading the transit of Mercury. And this is the big event, of course, that we've got coming up here very, very soon. Now, we're going to be making reference throughout this session today to the book Mercury, Money, and the Markets, Profitable Planetary Cycles for Short-Term Astro Trading. This is available at Amazon.com. And if you do not already have a copy of this book, I want to mention the fact that at the end of our session here today, I will give you a link to be able to get the book at I think it's a 30% discount, which should get you a better price than you can get it from Amazon at. So keep that in mind if you don't already have a copy. If you do have a copy and have it handy, you might want to refer to it as we move through our session here today. This is kind of a continuation of what we offered about 10 days ago or so with our session on the double deadly Mercury retrograde period that we are now in the midst of. And we've already seen some market reaction to this Mercury retrograde period. We spent some time with that session talking about what makes this particular Mercury retrograde interval so special and why we're convinced it's worth watching in terms of the market dynamics. So if you joined us for that session live, then you're up to speed with some of that information. We also, of course, have the recording of that session available. And I note here that some of you have ordered that recording as well. So it's a good material to review after the fact of our session here today, if you have not had a chance to look at it already. Essentially, right now, we are dealing with this Mercury retrograde period that began on April the 28th, with Mercury going retrograde at 23 degrees of Taurus. It will make its direct station at 14 degrees of Taurus on the 22nd of May, and then it will make its retrograde return on the 7th of June. Now, we define this as the primary retrograde period. We should note that within that context, however, we get two conjunctions of the Sun with Mercury, or Mercury with the Sun, I should say. The inferior conjunction occurring on the 9th of May, and then the superior conjunction coming on the 7th of July. So each retrograde period has certain focal points. Primarily, of course, we're concerned with that time frame when the the actual retrograde period is happening when Mercury seems to be moving backwards through the sky, which in this case is between April 28th and the 22nd of May. But then we track that additional period between May 22nd, in this case, and June 7th, when Mercury is still in the shadow of its retrograde dynamic. It's making up for the ground that it lost, essentially, during the retrograde point. So on June 7th, it gets back to the place it started on April 28th. That's why we flagged that particular date. Then we extend that, in this case, another month to the 7th of July, to the final conjunction of the Sun and Mercury, with Mercury back in direct motion. It's a particularly interesting point for some of the dynamics that we're talking about here today. So in addition to this, we have, of course, that inferior conjunction I just mentioned, the inferior conjunction of Mercury with the Sun. This will always occur while Mercury is in retrograde motion, and this is an important part of this overall retrograde cycle. It's one of those dates within the Mercury retrograde cycle that we always want to pay attention to as having some particular significance. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking here today, because we have an inferior conjunction of Mercury with the Sun coming up tomorrow on Monday, the 9th of May, 2016. Now, this particular inferior conjunction is also a transit of Mercury, and that's what makes this an unusual phenomenon, something a little bit different than what we would normally experience during the course of most Mercury retrograde periods. Every Mercury retrograde includes an inferior conjunction, but not all inferior conjunctions are also transits of Mercury. And that's the key point here. This is a special case dynamic that is added to the mix of everything we've already talked about in our webinar on the double deadly Mercury retrograde, and what makes this such an extraordinary example of the Mercury retrograde phenomenon. We have this laid on the top of that as well. So what exactly is a transit of Mercury? Now, there are lots of different ways of looking at this, and I think what we're going to do, if I can get the little link to work properly here, let me make sure I can do this before I promise it. Click on the little button on the side that says videos. And why is this not showing? Ha. Well, then maybe we won't see this little video from NASA that we had put up there. Apparently, it did not load properly. Let me just mention the fact here that you can go online and search the NASA website. They've got about a 3-minute video that explains all of the celestial dynamics. I wanted to show that at this point, but apparently the connection dissolved on me here, probably because Mercury is retrograde. Who knows? But we'll see what the problem is with that. At any rate, I thought that was loaded properly, but let's see. Don't know that we can back up and get that on the there. As I say, it's about 3 minutes. It just shows the dynamics and talks about how to view it. By the way, NASA has a great website for most celestial phenomena. And it's kind of interesting because, of course, they talk about things from a purely scientific and astronomic perspective. We want to be aware of that. And one of the things that NASA is doing tomorrow during the course of this transit of Mercury, they'll be providing online live footage from their telescopes so that you can watch the transit. Now, this will begin around 7 a.m. Eastern time, U.S. time, tomorrow morning. That is to say, roughly 14 hours from now, and it will continue until shortly before 3 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. It takes a while for this transit to occur. Now, what's going on with this transit is we're able to see through a telescope the body of the planet Mercury moving across the face of the Sun. This is an unusual alignment, and this is what we call a transit of Mercury. in the terminology used by the astronomers, the guys that spend their time looking through the telescope, the guys and gals, I should say here, because what they're doing here is observing things, of course, from the Earth and looking at the celestial phenomena in various ways. This is a rare occurrence because they can observe the planet Mercury moving across the face of the sun with the sun in the background. And this is what we mean by a transit of Mercury. It's a fairly spectacular phenomenon. You can't see it with the naked eye because you'd be staring into the sun and it would blind you. There are certain precautions that you can take using a telescope, of course, to enlarge it so that you can see the planet Mercury, using the right kinds of filters so that you can aim the telescope at the sun, and it will be visible throughout most of the Western Hemisphere, at least for parts of that going on throughout the day tomorrow. Now, it's an unusual phenomenon. It's a great opportunity for viewing. What NASA suggests is if you have a local astronomy group nearby, chances are they're going to be spending some time observing this. And so what you're going to want to do is connect with that, and they typically welcome guests who want to come over so that they can show off their neat stuff with their telescopes. So if you have the opportunity to do that, that's a great thing to do. If that's not the case, or you're located in somewhere in the world where it's not visible in the sky, if it happens to be occurring during nighttime hours in your specific location, then you may want to go online and search nasa.org, and they will have their links to the live focusing of the telescope that they've got on the transit of Mercury, so that you can see it secondhand that way. So it's certainly something worth observing. Now, the information, of course, that NASA provides is how to observe it safely. Again, you'll find on the NASA website their little video about the transit of Mercury, why it happens, and how to observe it. It's about 3 minutes long, as I recall. So my apologies again for not having that link working here, but we can blame Mercury retrograde on that anyway. At any rate, that's the scientific explanation that you can get from NASA. It's certainly worth watching to get that viewpoint. And that is what the astronomers have to say. Now, we want to make a distinction here between astronomers and astrologers, because the astronomers, as I say, are the folks that spend their time looking through the telescopes and observing celestial phenomena. They learn a lot about the workings of the universe and add to the body of scientific knowledge in some significant ways. It is well worth connecting with their information. But they're really talking about the meanings of the events they observe in terms of what they can observe and discern about the geophysics involved. So they're hoping through this particular sighting of the transit of Mercury to learn more about Mercury's gravitational field and atmosphere. And that's certainly information worth having. What the astrologers do, on the other hand, is try to determine the implications for us on Earth of what's going on through these celestial phenomena. So we can get the observations from the scientists, we can study the cycles that are at work there, and then our job in the astrological community is to try to provide some reasonable courses of action or probable interpretations of the events that are going on in this regard. So from that perspective, we want to take a look at the transit of Mercury as well. Now, as we've already noted here, the transits of Mercury are kind of special case examples of inferior conjunctions. And when we talk about inferior conjunctions here, we are specifically talking about conjunctions of Mercury with the sun. It is a term that's applied in a very specialized sense that way. Now, in astrology, we talk about a conjunction as the meeting of any two planetary bodies at the same degree on the celestial ecliptic, and we note things in that manner. But when we talk about an inferior conjunction or a superior conjunction, typically what we're discussing here are the conjunctions of Mercury with the Sun. Now, the inferior conjunction occurs when we have Mercury between the Sun and the Earth. The two have lined up on the plane of the ecliptic, and Mercury is closer to the Earth than the Sun is. Remember that Mercury is inside the orbit of the Earth, and it orbits around the Sun. So there's a point in its orbit when it's between us and the Sun, and when it lines up with the Sun along the plane of the ecliptic, then we have what we call the inferior conjunction. This will only occur when Mercury is in retrograde motion. This is an important distinction to be made here, and something that we need to be aware of, because it means that we get this happening every time there's a retrograde period with Mercury. The superior conjunction, on the other hand, is the other part, or occurs during the other part of Mercury's orbit around the Sun. Now, Mercury moves very, very rapidly around the Sun. It only takes 88 days for it to make the full circuit that we take 365 days here on Earth to do. So the Mercury year is 88 days compared to our 365-day year, so to speak. So on the backside of that cycle, as Mercury goes behind the Sun and is lined up from the Earth's perspective directly behind the Sun, we call that the superior conjunction. And at that time, Mercury is in direct motion, as observed here from Earth. So we have these two distinct phenomena that occur each time that Mercury goes retrograde, with the superior conjunction occurring after Mercury has returned to direct motion. As we mentioned earlier, in this particular case, Mercury went retrograde on the 28th of April. The inferior conjunction is coming up tomorrow on the 9th of May. The superior conjunction will come on the 7th of July, after Mercury has been direct for about a month and a half. So we get 3 Mercury retrograde periods each year, sometimes a part of a fourth one, depending on where they fall on the calendar. But this will occur with some regularity, so this is not an unusual phenomenon. We kind of get used to this and reckoning with it in terms of our daily lives, in terms of our work with the markets and so forth. Now, each Mercury retrograde includes one of these inferior conjunctions. So an inferior conjunction is not a particularly rare phenomenon. But not all inferior conjunctions are also transits of Mercury. And that's the distinction that we want to make here today. This is what makes this occasion tomorrow so different and so special. And the real question is, why are they so rare? In other words, we get the inferior conjunctions fairly frequently. This should say, why are the transits of Mercury so rare? The inferior conjunctions are not, the transits of Mercury are, and that's our real question. And as astrologers, what we're doing, we mentioned here a moment ago, this flat plane way of viewing things. We condense the views of planetary actions to two-dimensional flat planes. And we do this so that we can represent things on pieces of paper and look at charts and try to make determinations on that basis. When in actuality, things are happening in a vast array of directions in spherical space. The plane that we refer to in astrology most frequently is the plane of the ecliptic. Now, the plane of the ecliptic is a great circle that cuts through the Earth based on the apparent path of the Sun. It extends out into infinity into the celestial sphere as well. This is hard to describe. It's a little easier to talk about or to show a picture of. The picture worth 1,000 words here. So this is a fairly crude representation of it. The big circle that we see around the outside is intended to represent a sphere, which is the celestial sphere. That is to say, it's the projection out into the heavens. The little blue ball in the middle is the Earth. And of course, we've got the Sun over on the right. The Earth is circling the Sun. And it is that Earth's orbit around the Sun that technically defines the plane of the ecliptic, but in fact, from Earth's point of view, it is the sun's passage through the sky from Earth's angle. So we get that plane of the ecliptic, which is defined as the path of the sun, that is a great circle cutting through the center of the celestial sphere, with the Earth at the middle of all that. We're looking at it geocentrically, and all of the positions then that we have in astrology on an astrological chart are represented as being projected onto the plane of the ecliptic. Now, the fact is the sun is always on the ecliptic. Various planetary bodies stay fairly close to it. When we are looking at Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, they're all pretty much within the range of that ecliptic path. But if we look at Mercury, if we look at Pluto, there are big variations from the plane of the ecliptic. They can be far above it or below it. The moon also moves radically on either side, above or below that plane of the ecliptic as well. So we're looking at things in three-dimensional space, spherically, and compressing it all into a flat diagram, and we're using the path of the sun to represent that. My point here is that there are many times when Mercury will align with the sun and be in alignment with it, but it will not be literally on the same plane. We project Mercury's position onto that ecliptic plane, and we call that an inferior conjunction or a superior conjunction. What happens in the meantime, or what happens in reality, however, is that Mercury on the vertical dimension can be above or below that ecliptic plane. So without generating too much confusion, what we're really talking about here is that a transit of Mercury is a phenomenon that occurs in spherical space, while inferior conjunctions are all referenced on the plane of the ecliptic. So we get that alignment vertically, so to speak, along with the alignment horizontally, that is on the plane of the ecliptic, at the time of a transit of Mercury, which means that from our standpoint here on Earth, we can look toward the sun and we can see the physical body of Mercury moving across the face of the sun. That's what makes the transit of Mercury so rare. So it acts very much in the same way that a solar or lunar eclipse acts, with a vertical alignment coinciding with a horizontal alignment, more or less, within spherical space, in order to get this kind of dramatic phenomenon that occurs. This can get very technical, very wordy. We don't want to get tangled up in that, but this is really the reason why it's so rare. We get these inferior conjunctions all the time, but not many of the transits of Mercury. So the question is, just how rare are they? Now, there's lots of a tendency to overstate things, especially in the popular press, about the rarity of various celestial phenomena. This is the first one in 1,000 years, or this has never happened before in all of recorded history. That kind of thing adds a lot of drama to it. This is not quite that rare, but it still is rare. Let's talk about how that all fits together here. Between the years 1601 CE and 2300 CE, that's a 700-year span, there are approximately 2,100 Mercury retrograde periods. And of course, with each one, there's an inferior conjunction. So we have about 2,100 inferior conjunctions, roughly, during a 700-year span. Now, we have done precise calculations on that same 700-year span, and we have found that between those same 700 years of 1601 to 2300, there are just 94 transits of Mercury that occur. So 2,100 inferior conjunctions, only 94 of them are transits of Mercury. So you can see that they're not extraordinarily rare, but they don't happen all that often just the same. So transits of Mercury can only happen during 2 calendar months on any given year. And this is an interesting part of this phenomenon. Of course, we can get Mercury retrograde just about any time during the year, and during the course of the retrograde period, we'll get that inferior conjunction. But when we get these specific lineups of Mercury with the sun in a transit of Mercury, they will always occur during one of 2 months, regardless of what year we're looking at. That's either in May or in November. And so this is something that we need to be aware of. Here we are in May, in this particular case, of course, approaching a transit of Mercury, and it's not unusual that it happens in May. I mean, it's either going to happen in May or happen in November if it happens at all, and it doesn't happen all the time, as we've just seen here. So in May, Mercury is in the descending node phase of its orbit around the sun. Now, what happens here is the orbit of Mercury is very distorted, it's very erratic, and it will move above and below that plane of the ecliptic. So as it hits this point of moving past the plane of the ecliptic, going from north to south, it is the descending node phase, and this will occur in May, whenever that happens, because of that relationship of the angles of the orbit of Mercury to the orbit of the sun. So in May, it is a descending node phase, and then in November it's the ascending node moving back in the opposite direction in its orbit around the sun. So we want to compare these two here and be conscious of them because of the distinctions between the two and several criteria here. First of all, when we look at all these Mercury transits, only 33% of them occur in the month of May at that descending node phase. And then in November, I think I got these reversed here, we've got the ascending node phase occurs in November, and 67% of those Mercury transits are there. The point here being, let me just double check this. Make sure that my statements match my notes here. May is the descending node. November is the ascending node. This is a misprint on these two slides. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I got that right here, because in doing all this research, we have a lot of information hanging on this, and if I'm misinforming you visually, I want to correct it verbally if we can do that along the way. And again, my apologies. And again, we can blame this on Mercury retrograde. Why not? At any rate, 2/3, literally, of the Mercury transits that occur when we get a transit of Mercury moving across the face of the sun, 2/3 of those are going to happen in the month of November, and that's the ascending node of the orbit of Mercury, and only 1/3 is going to be happening in the month of May in any given year, and that is the descending node in that case. So the distinction between the two is, a matter of curiosity. Scientifically, you can look up the descriptions of that in the astronomic tables and so forth. But it becomes very important when we start to backtest the impact of Mercury, transits of Mercury on the action in the markets. And that's, of course, our primary point of focus here at FinancialCyclesWeekly.com. What we're the most interested in doing is figuring out what these phenomena have to say about the prospects for us in the markets. So we can look at things in a variety of ways here. Let's talk about some of the back testing that we've done. We have daily records of Wall Street prices that go back to the 1880s. This is all fairly readily available. There have been speculative tables that have gone back with monthly averages to previous centuries, and we've got erratic things here and there. But at any rate, on a day-to-day basis, we have accurately recorded records that date back that far. So we can use a period going back 125 years, back to the year 1891 to be precise. And during that time, during the last 125 years, not counting the one coming up tomorrow, we've had 18 transits of Mercury so far. So this is the universe that we can backtest when we have accurate records of the price performance of the stock market on a day-to-day basis, and we also have the records of the transits of Mercury. So let's take a look at that. Here's what's happened in the stock market, and we're doing these calculations based on the daily price action of the Dow. Originally, there was an index of 12 stocks that was recorded that was kind of the precursor to the Dow, and then 20, and then 30, and so forth. But it gives us an index then of the market's behavior overall, and we do have the daily records there to go back and check. And what we're looking at is what happens immediately after these transits of Mercury. If it occurs on a trading day, then we look at the next trading day. Sometimes they'll occur on a weekend, and we'll look at the next available day and use that distinction there to determine what direction is the market gone in whenever this has occurred. So let's look at each of these. We only have 18 of them to look at, so we'll just take a couple of minutes and go through them. The first in our records here was on the 10th of May in 1891. The stock market went up 0.55%, a little bit more than 0.5% immediately after that. On November 10th, 1894, it was up by a little more than 1% immediately after that, 1.07% to be exact. Then on November 14th in 1907 was the next one. This was the biggest down move that we could determine, and the market dropped immediately after that transit of Mercury. It was down by 2.5% that day. This is an interesting thing to keep in mind here, especially when we begin to consolidate these numbers. The biggest down we had occurred on one of the November occurrences. Then on November 7th, 1914, we don't have trading records for that day. There was a transit of Mercury that day, but the markets closed, I think it was in July of that year, and did not reopen until December because of the beginning of the engagement in World War II. There was a interruption in the halls of capital, and so they shut down all trading in the stock market, so we don't have a record there. So we're basing really all of our conclusions about trends on 17 of the 18 iterations. This is the outlier here where we don't have market behavior to compare it to. Then on May 8th in 1924, the markets were up over 0.5%, about 2/3%, 0.68%, following that transit of Mercury. The next one was on November the 10th in 1927, up by more than 1.33%, up 1.38% immediately after that transit of Mercury. Then on May 11th in 1937, down fractionally, a little less than 0.2%, 0.18%, a downward move in the Dow immediately following the transit of Mercury in 1937. And 1940, November 11th was the date of the transit there, down by right at 0.5%, 0.51% immediately after that transit of Mercury. The next transit did not come until 13 years later, on November 14th, 1953. The Dow was down immediately after that by 0.58%, almost 0.6%, right after that transit. Then on the 6th of May in 1957, we also had a down response in the markets, a bearish response, 0.69% move to the downside right after that Mercury transit. Then the transit of Mercury on November 7th, 1960, the beginning of a new decade, the Dow was up by more than 0.75%, 0.77% after that event. On the 10th of November 1973, again, 13 years later, we had a negative response in the markets. The Dow was down by 1.18%. Immediately after that. Then on November 13th, 1986, we have another 13-year interval occurring there, and we see an up pattern. The Dow was up by 0.61%. On that occurrence. Then on November 6, 1993, the markets were up by a little over 0.1%, a minor move there, 0.12% in November of 1993. In 1999, November 15th, was the transit of Mercury, and the Dow responded by going up about 1.6%, 1.59% to be exact. On the 7th of May, 2003, the Dow was down immediately after that by 0.81%. And then the most recent one that has occurred was on the 8th of November in 2006, 10 years ago, and the Dow was down by 0.6%. In response to that celestial event, the transit of Mercury in November of 2006. Now, as I've gone through these dates, you may have noticed some patterns, and the patterns of the occurrence of the transits of Mercury are a little hard to determine. And in fact, there is a 13-year cycle that comes within very, very close to particular correspondence with 54 orbits of Mercury around the Sun. And then there's also a 33-year cycle that's an even closer correspondence to 137 orbits around the Sun. So astronomers look at the recurrence of a 33-year cycle and a 13-year cycle, and they kind of overlap in certain ways, which is why sometimes we get these occurrences coming a little bit more frequently in terms of the specific occurrences of the transits of Mercury. So it's not something that happens with just one cycle rhythmically, like every 12 years or every 13 years. It's a little bit more complex than that. But our aim here is not to try to figure out all the cycles. The astronomers have done a good job of that. We can look all that up. But what we're looking at here is what has happened in terms of this past performance. Remembering, of course, that past performance does not guarantee future results. We still want to find out what the past performance was in the markets. So if we take all the transits of Mercury in this data set that we've just examined, take them as one group, the average response in the market was at 50 to almost 53% of the time, 52.9% of the time, the Dow went down immediately following a transit of Mercury. Well, a little bit better than a coin toss there, slightly bearish bias. And the average loss, when we add them all together, average it all out, immediately following the transit of Mercury, average loss 0.08%. Less than 0.1%, essentially a flat response. Not much exciting to talk about there in terms of discrepancies from the norm. But this is where things start to get interesting for us as we examine the distinctions between the ascending and descending node transits of Mercury. For the transits of Mercury at the descending node in May, that is correct, that's the descending node, the average market response has been that 66.7% of the time, 2/3 of the time, the market has dropped following a transit of Mercury that occurs in May, an average loss of right at 1/4%. For each of those occurrences during May, when we've had the descending node transit of Mercury. Now, contrast that to what happens with the transit of Mercury at the ascending node in November. The average market response there has been, it's been up 54.5% of the time. A little bit better than half, but the average gain has been almost 0.75%. Remember that we saw that largest loss during one of those November transits of Mercury. The 2.5% drop that occurred on one occasion was pretty extreme, but still the average return here on the transits that occur in November is a gain of almost 0.75%, 0.73%. Now, this is a very, very interesting phenomenon here. When we compile all this data, it says that the timing of the transit of Mercury is extremely important for us as we look at it as a phenomenon in the markets. There are fewer transits of Mercury at the descending node, which comes in May, but they are much more bearish for the equities markets. So when we're looking at one coming up in May, as we are right now, our expectations are on to the downside of the market. There are more transits of Mercury that occur at the ascending node, which takes place in November, whenever it occurs. They have a much more bullish impact on equities markets. So the transits of Mercury at the descending node, which occurs in May, we could take as further confirmation then of that old trader's adage to sell in May and go away, right? Typically, we've discovered that there's this pattern in the markets. They tend to kind of peak around late April, early May with equities, and in terms of longer-term cycles, then that enters in a period of lower prices over the next few months immediately following that. This seems to reinforce that. We're not saying that transits of Mercury are the sole cause of that, because we don't get one every May, and it occurs fairly rarely, in fact, that we have them occurring in May. But when that happens, it adds to the notion that we should look at getting back on the short side of the market one way or another in terms of equities. But if the equity markets aren't favored by the upcoming transit of Mercury, that's coming up here tomorrow on the 9th of May in 2016, then what should we be looking at instead? I mean, we've got all kinds of different trading situations that we can examine. And if you've got your copy of Mercury, Money, and the Markets, we want to recommend that you spend a little time reviewing Chapter 9 in that book, because that's exactly what this talks about, not in the sense of the transits of Mercury, but in terms of the inferior conjunctions of Mercury. And this is a critical point there. This is a chapter on the Emerald Tablet trades. You'll find it on pages 195 to 210 in that book. So take a little time, review that material. I think you'll find it very, very helpful here if you have a copy of the book. But let's take just a minute and review what that's all about. When we talk about the Emerald Tablet trades, we're referring here to the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. Pardon me, sip of water here. So with Hermes Trismegistus, this is the a document that goes back into ancient antiquity. And of course, Hermes, another name for Mercury in the ancient world. And so the Emerald Tablet was attributed to him. And it's interesting, you know, we have a translation of the Emerald Tablet included in the book, Mercury, Money, and the Markets. Essentially, it talks about the mightiest of all mighty powers. This will overcome every subtle thing, has the power to penetrate every solid substance. Thus was the world created. For this reason, I'm called Hermes, the thrice greatest, one in essence, three in aspect. I possess three parts of the wisdom of the whole universe. That which I have to say about the work of the sun is completed. This is the concluding stanza of the Emerald Tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus here, talking about the work of the sun. This is what the document purports to be about. He also refers to it as the miracle of the one thing in the course of the document. Very mysterious stuff in many respects. But the essential nature of the Emerald Tablet is that this phrase near the beginning, that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. This has been condensed in popular culture through the centuries as with the phrase, as above, so below. And so it's that sense of correspondence between what is below and what is above. And this is one of those key factors, one of the key tenets in esoteric lore throughout the world. Something, again, quite mysterious. Lots to ponder there. We won't go into a lot of depth about that, but to simply say that from a study of this document, we came to some interesting conclusions here. First of all, that the as above phrase, because this is about Mercury, remember, it's about Hermes and attributed to Hermes, this can refer to this superior conjunction, the superior conjunction between Mercury and the Sun during the orbital transit of Mercury, or the path of Mercury, that occurs with some regularity every 88 days. The so below is the inferior conjunction. So the below here is the inferior conjunction, the above is the superior conjunction. The ancients knew about the difference in those cycles, and it's encapsulated in those phrases to refer to the work of the sun. And for us today, the work of the sun is the business of trading gold, whether we're trading in equities related to gold, or gold mining stocks, or ETFs, or in the metal itself, or in the futures market. Anything relating to gold trading, we can reference with regard to the work of the sun because of that ancient correspondence between the sun and the precious metal gold. So we have that connection very, very strongly made there. And that's what we think is being described by this ancient document, and what we have tested here in our book on Mercury, money, and the markets, in that ninth chapter of the book, on what we call the Emerald Tablet trades. Gold prices at the time of the Superior Conjunction tend to coincide with the price range that gold was trading in during the previous Inferior Conjunction. So what happens is we pay particular attention then to the Inferior Conjunction of Mercury and the Sun, whenever that comes up during a Mercury retrograde cycle. And we're going to pay attention to what's going on with gold at that particular time frame, because it's going to give us critical information about what's likely to happen then at the Superior Conjunction. Now remember that we said that the Superior Conjunction will occur after Mercury goes back into direct motion at the end of the retrograde phase. So this information is the most valuable for trading when we have a wide price excursion following the Inferior Conjunction. So we look at the price of gold at the time of the Inferior Conjunction. We track that then immediately afterwards over the next couple of weeks, and the more the price departs from that range that it was trading at the time of the Inferior Conjunction, the greatest potential the trade has for being profitable if we get a return back to that trading range at the time of the Superior Conjunction. The advantage that we have astrologically is knowing ahead of time when the Superior Conjunction will occur, and the high likelihood of prices coming back to that same trading range at that point in the gold trading cycle. So for this current Emerald Tablet trade setup, what we're going to do here is we'll be watching gold prices tomorrow on Monday, the 9th of May, 2016. We're going to note the high and the low. That gives us the trading range for the day for gold. Now, what we're saying here is we'll be looking ahead to the prices as we move closer to the Superior Conjunction that will come on the 7th of July in 2016. So what happens there is not that the prices will duplicate exactly, but that there will typically be an overlap of the price range during the two trading periods. So we'll get a high and a low for gold on Monday, the 9th of May. We'll make a note of that. And the more that gold departs from that price range, either above or below it, then the greater the potential for a trade can be. So if gold drops after that and goes well below that trading range, then if we see signs that gold is making a bottom and starting to move back upward, we can project a move back up to that trading range by the 7th of July, and it gives us a very specific time frame to work with. Does this work 100% of the time? No, unfortunately, but it works enough of the time that we have found it to be a very, very reliable indicator for trading gold based on the occurrence of the Inferior Conjunction between Mercury and the Sun. That's what we've got going on tomorrow, and this transit of Mercury is a special case, of course, of the Inferior Conjunction. That gives us a little extra clout, so to speak, in giving it our time and attention. We want to be sure that we're watching this potential setup for an Emerald Tablet trade. Now, in the book, Mercury, Money, and the Markets, you'll find the listing of the dates and the times, I think, as well, for all of the inferior and superior conjunctions between the Sun and the Mercury. It's amended to this chapter on the Emerald Tablet trades. So take a look at that. Lists them all between the years 2012 and 2015, or 2050, pardon me. You've got 40-something years, almost 38 years there that you have specific dates that you can set up trades using this. And in this particular case, what we're doing is seeing that accelerating factor of the transit of Mercury added to the mix there as well. So we think this is well worthwhile paying attention to. So again, this page is 195 to 210 of your book on Mercury, Money, and the Markets. If you do not have a copy of the book, you can get it at a 30% discount if you go to bit.ly/Mercury30. It's a capital M with Mercury and then number 30 at the end there. That will send you to a web page where you can get the price automatically discounted by 30% off the cover price of the book. Again, I wanted to offer that to you during this webinar. If you are watching the recording of the webinar after the fact, that still applies to you. We'll keep that page up and make that available to you. As I say, it will give you a little bit better price than you can get even on Amazon with that in order to encourage you to use this as a reference material. There's lots of valuable information in the book, so we definitely want to encourage you to make sure that you have a copy of that. There's one more factor. We're about to wrap things up here, but we should consider an additional thing that's a little bit different with this particular transit of Mercury that occurs on the 9th of May. As I mentioned, we've got the transit occurring between roughly 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow on the 9th of May. That's when it will be visible through the telescopes. So we'll want to be aware of that time frame in general. But in the midst of that, there is a Jupiter direct station that's occurring. While the transit of Mercury is going on, Jupiter changes direction in the sky. A very, very intriguing configuration there. I have not been able to find a previous record of this having occurred before. If any of you are doing long-term historical astrological research and find one, let me know, and we'll see if we can find a point of correspondence there. But it's a very intriguing dynamic. The Jupiter stations occur once a year, but the occurrence, of course, of the transit of Mercury is a much rarer phenomenon. We've got 18 of them in the last 125 years. So, the potential times when it could happen are fairly rare. And again, I'm not seen one on the same date as a Jupiter direct station previously. But doesn't mean there hasn't ever been one. So, but let's take a look at that very quickly as we wrap things up here today, because this is the chart for this Jupiter direct station. Again, the retrograde period, or excuse me, the transit of Mercury rather begins a little after 7 a.m. Eastern time. The Jupiter station is at 8:16 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow. So it's coming in about an hour just after the beginning of this phase of Mercury making its transit here. Now, to start with, of course, we want to identify. Here's the place where we find Mercury and the Sun. Sun at 19 degrees 17 minutes of Taurus, Mercury at 19 degrees 29 minutes of Taurus. It's still in the early phases of that transit. Now, it's interesting here because we've got a distinction here of what is it, 12 minutes of arc, something like that. So it's a very small amount of the actual arc size of the Sun. So we time the exact inferior conjunction a little bit later in the day when we get the closest alignment between the center of Mercury and the center of the Sun along that plane of the ecliptic. So I think that occurs at 11:20 a.m. if I'm not mistaken, something like that, about 3 hours later. But so this transit of Mercury takes a little bit of time. It's moving retrograde again, backing up from 29 minutes to all the way back to 17 minutes at 19 degrees of Taurus during the course of the day. So interesting phenomenon to keep an eye on there. And again, what this looks like on an astrological chart doesn't tell us that it is a transit of Mercury. It just says we've got a conjunction of Mercury and the Sun coming up here at this particular point in time. Then at the bottom of the chart wheel, we've got Jupiter down here. Jupiter at 13 degrees 15 minutes of Virgo, making its direct station. Now, as it does so, it takes on enormous power and significance. Jupiter stations tend to coincide fairly strongly with shifts in equities markets and in some commodities markets as well. So it certainly adds to the energy of this particular Mercury transit to have this outer planet station, the direct station of Jupiter, going on literally simultaneously. It's quite an unusual phenomenon in that regard. And of course, what we look at then are the angular relationships between Jupiter and other planets at that time. And so as we examine all of this, we're looking at Jupiter being in a trine to Venus. That's that green line with Venus at 11 degrees of Taurus. It's in opposition to Neptune at 11 degrees of Pisces, and a square to Saturn. Saturn's at 14 degrees, but still with an orb of a square to Saturn at 14 Sagittarius there. So we get not just the impact of the Jupiter station itself, but also connecting with Neptune, adding to speculative energy in the markets, connecting with Saturn, emphasizing this big tug of war between bullish and bearish forces at the time. The trine to Venus suggests a slightly bullish bias coming out of that dynamic. But what happens is it may very well be an enormous fake out, given the fact that Mercury is retrograde at the time, given the fact that we have this inferior conjunction of Mercury and the Sun, and especially given the fact that this is occurring during this very rare transit of Mercury that we have going on May the 9th in 2016. So these are some of the factors that we're looking at that make this an unusual event, and it is how we have assessed the trading prospects then for this transit of Mercury. It's a very, very different kind of phenomenon, not something that we look at frequently in astrology, mainly because it doesn't occur that frequently. And whenever we see it, we kind of note it. And I thought it was worthwhile, especially in terms of our ability to backtest with the markets, to take a more detailed look at this, because it falls within the context of this double deadly Mercury retrograde period here. So that's what we wanted to share here. We certainly are open to questions at this time. Let's see. I can stop the screen sharing there and get back to the actual picture. There we go. So we have the chat box open. If there are questions or comments that you would like to add, let's see if I can find the chat box on my screen here. Okay, we've gotten some questions in. Let's see what they are here. Have you started the session? Okay. We're waiting for the start. Okay, what kind of problems are we having here? Oh my goodness, this is saying, are we starting? This is not good news at all. We had everybody joining, and what's going on here? So if you have been on the call and missed everything, I tried to move the chat box out of the way when I tried to play that video earlier. And if we are not getting that, something has gotten disconnected along the way. Hopefully we have our video recorded here, and we will get you all recordings of this pronto. My apologies if we've had the discrepancies there. I've got wrapped up in the presentation and did not have the chat open. So again, to Michael and Antonio and the others who have made those comments, that's the best. Okay. Antonio is saying this is the best demonstration of Mercury going retrograde. Well, maybe that's the case. And I'm not seeing anything here that indicates that we're not communicating as we should. So we'll see what we got out of this, and hopefully be able to share this recording with you. Again, my apologies for apparently we had a number of people get disconnected during the session here. So we'll take care of this, and we'll get back to you with a recording of this as quickly as possible. Again, my apologies for that. And we'll be paying attention to these transits of Mercury, the transit of Mercury coming up tomorrow. So thanks again for joining us, even though things got a little discombobulated, it looks like, once again, with our webinar connections here today. So hopefully we'll have the recording and be able to share that very rapidly with you. So this is Tim Boss of FinancialCyclesWeekly.com. Thanks so much for trying to join us here today. And if you're watching the recording after the fact, then you certainly have been spared that inconvenience as well. So take care, everybody. Enjoy the transit of Mercury and the trading opportunities that it presents, which I think are quite extraordinary.